Hello, retro fans. This episode has some sort of a sad background, and the strange thing is that I started to work on this episode a few days ago, and I have prepared a couple of things and tested a couple of things, and then suddenly today I've learned that Jonas Neubauer, who's really famous in the classic Tetris scene, has passed away totally unexpected. And there are no background information, something like this. But this is indeed a very sad moment. But I think he has enjoyed playing Tetris a lot, and I think he wishes that all of us just continue with this. And as I said, I was working on this episode already, and I decided, well, I'm going to make it anyway, and I'm going to present to you what I have done in order to play classic Tetris on the NES, which isn't basically not so complicated, but it has a couple of twists here and there, and what I have done in order to improve my, let's say, game experience. And that's basically what this episode is all about. And I will cover video scaler just as a part of the topic as well. Anyway, let's get started. So, and as usual, let's start with a view to my desk, because this is what we are going to talk about today. And as you can see, it is a bit messy as usual. So I have basically my classic Nintendo Entertainment System. I have the compact scalar unit FrameMeister XRGB Mini, and I have the OSSC, the open scale, open source scale, whatever it means, OSSC. And this may cause some confusion, but let me dig into details. What's the reason of this setup? And basically, the way to play the classic Tetris on the NES is basically not so tricky. I mean, you insert the cartridge and then you start playing. But nowadays, where it is a little bit tricky to run a system like this on a standard CRT monitor, for example, where I have actually not one available, and I haven't even considered, well, freeing up the space for it. It is always a question how to connect those old consoles to monitor systems like we are using today. And I'm talking especially about HDMI monitors. And the main thing I was facing during gameplay on the NES or on the C64 is that most of the time I'm running those devices through HDMI converters like the FrameMeister or the OSST or the RetroTink, for example, convert the signal to HDMI and feed this into either a monitor or into a capture system on my PC. But the thing is, especially with the capture system and running it through OBS, for example, like I do for recording videos, all of these steps require to convert the signal and bring it back to, well, my eyes, is adding delays to the whole experience. And whereas this is perhaps not a big problem for certain games like let's say arcade racing games or something like this. I mean, and even jump and runs, after a while you adapt to this sort of delay, and if there isn't anything you really have to react upon quite suddenly and unexpectedly, then you really just learn to press the button a little bit earlier, so to say. This works kind of for most of the games, as I said. But if you get closer to, let's say, a more challenging gameplay, and I'm talking not really about professional level, I'm just talking about doing this for fun. And you're playing games like, let's say, for example, the NES Classic Tetris, or if you play games like horizontal shooters like Soul Force on the C64, for example, where you have to act on a very, let's say, micro level of time. We're talking about frames per second or something like this, where you have to face opponents, bullets, missiles, whatever coming towards you, and where it is really important to have the correct timing. Then this whole approach of feeding the signals through converter, through capture cards, through capture software is not really working very well. And my problem was that if I present something on the C64 or on the NES, for example, during the recording of my videos, I had actually no choice in just running it through OBS, for example. But while I was working on a completely different topic, I came up with an idea that was really kind of an enlightenment, I have to say. And the core element of this is basically that most of the C64s I'm using, they have at least 2 video outputs. And then it really was such a great moment that I came up that my NES has at least 3 different video outputs. And by using 2 scalars, I have basically the opportunity to run one signal through, for example, the frame meister into the capture card, into OBS, recording the video, and I'm using the RGB output of the NES, running it through the OSSC, and feed this signal directly into the HDMI monitor in front of me. So basically, I'm talking about 2 different signals, 2 different HDMI feeds, so to say. And the interesting thing is that if I run those 2 HDMI sources side by side, I mean, I got this small monitor in front of me and I got this bigger monitor on the other side. And here is on the left hand side is OBS, and in front of me is the NES signal. You really can see the difference. And by doing so, I really felt a, well, big improvement, probably not to say a huge improvement in my gameplay. I mean, I'm still bad at gaming. Anyway, that's not going to change by this, but it at least feels much better for me. And even if you may consider that this is some sort of overkill, but I mean, I have the scalars available because I use them for different purposes, and therefore it was really quite easy to come up with the system, with the setup. And the interesting thing is that, as I've mentioned, the C64 has at least 2 different video outputs as well. It is usually not recommended to run them in parallel, but if you have a modified C64 with a different modulator, for example, then this is usually not really a big problem. And if you can see this adapter here, for example, we have the S-video signal here and we have the composite video signal here. And therefore I could run the S-video signal through the FrameMeister, for example, and the composite video through the RetroTink, and therefore can establish the very same setup I'm using for the NES right now. So much about the scalars. As I said, I was working on a completely different topic, therefore these scalars were involved, but more about this in some of the next episodes. Today it's about Classic Tetris, and you may wonder, maybe you never have seen it before, then let's have a look at the game itself, which I'm talking about. And this is really the very old NES Tetris, which you may know from the first Game Boy, from the black and white Game Boy. This is almost the same Tetris version. And here, this is the version that was sold for the NES. And as you have seen, this from 1989. I'm kind of surprised that it is so late released in the 80s. I have expected to see this much earlier, because I think on the arcade machine it was available much earlier. And if you are coming from the C64, like I'm, for example, you have played Tetris perhaps even earlier than 1989. So I had no C64 in the 80s, so I was playing Tetris later. But basically, there are a lot of interesting clones, whatever we want to call this, on the C64 as well. But today it is about NES. And as you can see, I have a couple of controllers here on my desk. And they look all a little bit different. And there's a specific reason behind this. And now I'm going to talk about these controllers. The main thing I was facing with the standard NES controller is basically that the button movement of this, let's change this a little bit. So the button movement of this 4-directional cross, whatever we want to call this, is usually quite large, so to say. We really talk about, I think, 2 or 3 millimeters. And if you are not a dash player, like Jonas, for example, and you are just pressing the key as much as it is required to move the piece to a certain place, then this becomes quite easily an issue, because every time you have to bridge this kind of huge distance. And since I'm not a teenager anymore, I'm getting older, I'm getting slower, every millimeter counts, at least for me. And I came up with this issue, problem, whatever, especially with this controller, because this is an USB controller. I got this from eBay for about 7-8 euros or something like this. So this is indeed really cheap, but interestingly, it is almost a one-to-one replica of the original Nintendo controller. Even on the inside, it looks almost identical. It just has an USB chip instead of this shift register chip. And it works mechanically almost the same as well. So, and over the Christmas time, I was playing NES Classic on the on my laptop, on the emulator, because I had no NES on hand, so to say. And I was really facing the issue that I couldn't get to certain levels in terms of speed, because I wasn't simply not able to press those buttons fast enough. And I considered playing Dash. Dash is actually just a technique that uses some sort of key repetition. So if you press a key and hold it, then the NES will start to move the piece automatically. But there's a short delay at the beginning before it starts to move the piece. Like if you press a key on the PC, for example, and hold it, then it will draw one jar, and then it waits a couple of milliseconds or something like this, and then it starts to draw more jars in a higher frequency, so to say. And for an effective dash playing, it is required to do some sort of, they call it pre-charge. So to avoid this little gap until this repetition starts, you kind of move the piece you have actually on screen into a direction where it can't move anymore, a so-called wall charge or a piece charge if you run this against the piece. and then you simply hold the key, and then the next piece will start to move immediately without this little break at the beginning. But this requires such amount of timing and such amount of precision that I'm absolutely not able to do this. So I stick to this high frequency button pressing. The Tetris profis, they call it hyper tapping. I'm not going to say I'm a hyper tapper, because this requires, I think, 10, 11, 12 presses per second. I think I'm still too slow for this, but the technique is basically almost the same. Anyway, and this has led to a couple of thoughts how to improve the system. And therefore you can see all those controllers, they look a little bit different. And the main reason is that I started to investigate what's the reason for this long distance and how to solve this. And I came up with this controller as a very first test object. And I'm going to show you what I have done with this, because this is almost the same for the other controllers. And then I will dig into the details what I have done at the end. So let's open this one quite quickly. Just has 4 screws. It's a little bit faster than opening an original controller. And here you can see this is almost nothing inside. And the difference between this USB controller and an NES controller is that the NES controller is lacking this little screw here. And here we can see this is basically all we have inside. These are the buttons to turn the pieces. This is select and start, and this is our 4-directional thing. And this basically looks like this. So this is a little plastic piece, and this has basically 4 points where it presses those little rubber, what we call this, stamps or so. And the reason for this long distance is that this basically, this is placed like this, and this is placed on top, and in the middle we have this little bump, and this bump is responsible for the distance between the buttons and this PCB. And the way it is designed is that you really have to go through this whole distance to press this little rubber button onto the PCB. And by adding this little sheet of paper, kind of a shim, so to say, I have actually created some sort of preload or something like this, a pre-tension, because this piece is kind of limited by this upper case. And especially for this controller, I even added here another sort of shim in order to lower it already, so that it is getting closer to the PCB already. So this is basically limited by this little bump, and is not working very well on the controller here, because if you get too close to the buttons, then you really tend to press more than one button by moving this little piece here, and this leads basically to some issues in certain games. It is not as important in the Classic Tetris, because you basically just use left and right and there's no other button required. But for standard games, jump and run, something like this, it is kind of horrible. So I may have to rework this as well. So this is basically just to explain the main principle. And let me just put this back together quite quickly. Otherwise, I'm probably going to lose a couple of parts. And then we'll move on to the standard classic NES controller. So this whole cutting paper approach wasn't really very satisfying, I have to say. And I came up with the idea, well, I can use my 3D printer to create new parts for those controllers, these controllers or whatever. And the first thing I did is I recreated this little shim with my 3D printer. And I was very, let's say, ambitious. And I have created 3 different thicknesses. So 0.1, 0.2 and 0.3 millimeters. Just to learn that the Prusa starts with 0.2 millimeters for the first layer. Anyway, you can change this, but it is not really affecting the thickness of the very first layer. So I wasn't really able to get below 0.2 millimeters, but at least I had one piece that is 0.2 and one that was 0.3. And I have used this in this controller the very same way. So I took this little part, put this shim onto it, and therefore got closer to the PCB already. And then I was able to make this distance a little bit shorter than on the original controller. And as this was working quite successfully, I did the very same for these buttons as well. So I created little shims, which I think it was 8 millimeters in diameter or something like this, with different thicknesses, added this to the buttons, and learned that this is improving the turning of the piece as well. And usually turning of the piece is not so time critical like moving the piece left and right because of the distance. I mean, most of the pieces you just turn once in one direction, but it just felt better to have a shorter distance on those buttons. And there's a limit, and I think I've reached the limit with one of my controllers here. If the distance is too short, you may have some, let's say, accidental turns. So you really have to get off the button so that the piece stops turning. So, and this is just something I have to incorporate into my technique, so to say. But I try to adjust this over the shims, and if I'm going to find the optimum, I'm going to recreate those buttons as well. And in order to make this more visible so that I can see which controller is modified and which is original, and just to avoid that someone is blaming me of cheating, I have used this kind of colorful filament. This is basically a PrusaPrinters. This is PETG. And for this one, I have used a PLA because this was printed with this soluble material, PVA. So you can put this part, I did the support material, I was going to say. Since the button is printed upside down, so basically this is the most important point, because as you can see, this is not flat. This has some kind of a little bulb or so, or it is a little well, it is not flat. And the main reason is that if you press this down, then this area gets kind of in parallel to the button, and therefore this is really important to recreate this very same shape. And therefore I have printed this way, and I had to use some support material on the button side, so to say, in order to make this possible. And as you can see, the surface isn't really, it's a little bit hard to see. I'm going a little bit closer. The surface isn't really very nice. I mean, actually, this is not really a problem because it is covered by the controller, but the distance or the thickness of this thing is very crucial, and we really talk about a tenth of a millimeter, even a little bit smaller, perhaps a 20th of a millimeter or something like this. And due to the support material I have used, I came up with the first one, which was way too thick, so it wasn't working. And then I was printing the next one. It was a little bit thinner. And then I decided, okay, let's move on to PLA. This is temperature-wise closer to PVA, and therefore it is easier to mix those two materials. And then I have printed this one with this water-dissolvable filament, and got a way more better quality compared to this one. So this is what I have done in terms of controllers. And the very next thing I did, and this is basically my standard procedure, I have cleaned those controllers, and I'm going to show you how I have done this with this one. I think I have opened and closed the controller so often that it won't take too long, and then those screws aren't working anymore. So those controllers basically are original controllers from 1980 something. So they are basically very old, and they are usually very dusty. And as I said, I've cleaned all those controls already, but I'm going to show you how this is going to work. And as I said, this is almost the very same like we have seen in this USB controller. And we can take this apart, and there is no screw. It just fits into this box and then stays there. And what I'm doing actually is I'm taking all those parts out of this case, and then I just wash them with some soap, and then I dry this, and then I will just wait until it is really dry, and then I use this silicone grease spray, and this creates a very a sort of a layer film, something like this, on these parts. And usually I do not spray this directly onto the parts because this is way too much, and then it becomes sticky, and it is not really the way I like it. So most of the time I just using some kind of a tissue, something like this, and then I just spray a little amount of it onto the tissue, and then I just touch briefly the parts of these little plastic things which are in movement, just to reduce the friction a little bit. And this is basically what I'm doing on this side. And on the PCB, I'm removing all the dust, as I said, and then I'm using this, I may have seen this already in some of my episodes, a WD-40 contact spray to clean the contacts, and you can just spray this onto the PCB, and then I'm using some sort of tissue as well. Go briefly over those little contacts, and it's really important that you're not using any abrasive material, because these are basically some sort of resistors, and if you're going to remove this layer, then this PCB isn't working any longer. So it's really just about cleaning, and as you can see, it is indeed a little bit dirty. So I haven't cleaned this one for a while. And that's basically all I'm doing with this stuff. And then I'm going to put this back together. Just have to find the right direction. And yeah, I'm going to show you this little shims I have created. Here you can see this. And they are placed inside the buttons. Visible? Yeah. And they are very thin 0.2 millimeters, something like this. And this is just to reduce the distance of the buttons I have to press. So then let's put this back together. And always have to remember which way we have to align this little cable. But on the PCB you can see it, so it's actually not so tricky. Just have to go through those little two pins, and then we have to use this sort of whatever meander, slalom, chicane, and then put this back together. So screws are still tight, but this little crosshead is going to wear out. So I may have to find a replacement for those screws. And it's really important that you tighten them. Not too strong, but there should be some sort of resistance. You should feel that you have reached the end. And then we forgot this little piece of rubber. Anyway, I'm going to solve this. Not yet. I just have to keep it in mind that this is basically not working right now. And we have plenty of other controllers, and then we may have a short little game of Tetris, and hopefully I can present to you that these modified controllers are working better than the original controllers. Unfortunately, I just have 3 of those controllers and I have modified all of them, so basically I can't show you. Well, I could assemble an original one, but well, let's keep it like this, and let's move on to have a short little game of Tetris. And here we can see it is running already, and not going to play any music because this may cause some copyright issues. And usually in the Classic Tetris World Championship, people start at level 18. I mean, we can just we can do this just for fun to see how fast this is. And most of the time I play level 12 to 14, something like this. This is basically what I can handle. And yeah, that's the way it is. So, okay, then let's start it. So as you can see, this is really very fast, and I have the first misdrop, and I have the next misdrop, and this is probably going to kill us quite quickly. There's really no time to think about the placement of those parts. Usually, if I play level 18 for a while, let's say 30, 40, 45 minutes, something like this, I more or less get used to the speed, but it is really not a very pleasant gameplay, so to say. We are probably not going to make a big score with this one now, but we can move on to a different speed. I'm not going to get that part over there. So anyway, that's really not something I'm going to present any longer in this video. So let's move back to a speed that is more handleable. Let's go for level 14 and see if this is making a difference. And as you can see, it is way slower already. And we have to take into consideration that actually I'm playing, that was really worse. It's really hard to play and to talk at the same time. I'm playing the PAL system, and the NTSC system is even faster. So this isn't really that much better than level 18. But let me give me another try, and then I think it's going to be enough anyway. So as you can see at the high score, sometimes I'm able to achieve a better score, so this is not all of the time that I'm playing so badly, but as I said, it is really a little bit tricky to play and to talk at the very same time. And surprisingly, this playing Tetris is quite demanding for the brain, because you not just look where you placed the current part, you really have to look where you place the next part, and quite often you really have to change this when you are seeing what's coming next after the second part. So you really have to do some micro adjustments at the very last microsecond, at the very last frame, and then so we set up a nice long piece dependency on the left hand side. So let's see if we can get out of this, and we set up another one, but sometimes it is the way it is. So let's see if we can make some space on the other side. It is really tricky playing and talking. Well, I may have practiced this. So, making some progress, kind of cleaned our stack. So now we can move on, hopefully scoring some Tetrises. So, coming back to Jonas, he is really very famous in the classic Tetris scene. I mean, he is a 7 times world champion, and the interesting thing is, oops, little misdrop here, that he has created a lot of videos, not just him playing Tetris. Now he's explaining how to play Tetris as well. So if you are looking into this topic, or if you're interested in to look into this topic a bit more, then I really recommend to head over to his channel and watch a couple of his videos and get a good impression how to approach playing Tetris nowadays. And I think that's going to be the end of this game anyway. That's all I want to show you playing Tetris anyway, and I hope you had some learning from this video. And as usual, thank you very much for watching, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions and ideas, whatever. Please feel free to use the comment section as usual, and then well, see you for the next episode. Bye bye.